Here at Early Excellence, we've been putting together a starter pack for Key Stage 1 practice for those of you who are getting started in terms of continuous provision in Key Stage 1. And as we've been doing it, we've been talking to lots of people about their practice in Key Stage 1, and it's been interesting. It's raised quite a lot of questions. And so we talked about getting together and sharing some of those questions, but also some of our responses to the questions as well. So, Nova, you've got some of the questions that people have been asking. Should we go straight in with the first one? Would that be all right?
Absolutely. So the first one then that I know we all get asked an awful lot is along the lines of, we want to, or we've been asked to introduce continuous provision in year one, year two, or both. But at the moment, we've only got a limited budget, or we want to do it quickly. And in the long term, there might be more budget. But at the moment, what is there that we can introduce without having that big budget available to it? So it's that kind of starting point, and that's really going back to thinking about, well, what is there in the school already that you can utilise?
So I think naturally, like one of the first areas that comes to mind is like your book area. I think most classrooms have a book area, or certainly some sort of a reading space. But it's actually about how well you develop that space. We don't want it to become kind of like a tokenistic book area that the children don't really get a chance to access. It just looks nice. But actually it's a space that's really usable, and that you've really thought about those books that are in that space, why they're there, how they link to your curriculum, what the children are going to get out of those books. And perhaps things that sit alongside those books. It might be that actually you've got some books in those areas that link to things that you're looking at the moment as well. So have you got artifacts that could sit with those books perhaps, that children could be looking at, or puppets perhaps that children could be using to develop their kind of oral storytelling skills as well. So for me, like I feel like the book area is quite an easy one for
It
most
is an
people
easy
to.
one, yeah. And it's one that you can kind of decide to do tomorrow, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the other thing I'd say alongside that is look at the quantity of books, because often it's completely overwhelmed with books squashed into book boxes, and we want to really reduce that. Smaller number of books, make sure they're organised, forward facing if at all possible, that we've really thought about the range that's offered at any one time. And also make sure the space is really focused on the books. It's really tempting, isn't it, to make, I don't know, a book fort or a book woodland or forest or something really exciting, and actually what you get there will be role play, chances are, rather than reading and all of that shared experience that we want. If we go back to thinking about what's there in school, another one to think about would then be your maths area. Again, lots of classrooms will have a selection of maths resources, but in a similar way to the books, what we don't want is a maths area that has all the resources that we're going to use for our teaching, and enough for 30 children. We want to make sure that it's a really well organised maths area with resources for a small number of children who are going to use those. Of course, there needs to be that link between what's there in our teaching, but making sure that you've got an area for children to access maths resources for whenever they need them.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to throw in workshop for my area. I think that it would be an area that you could, of course, just by its nature, you could equip with materials that actually, could be recycled materials, so packaging, boxes, a wide range of different sorts of bottle tops and things to join and so on. That would be perfect for looking at design and technology, teaching the children certain skills, teaching them opportunity. Well, taking opportunity to design materials and to use materials effectively. So, and of course, that is just, as I say, by its nature, something that actually you're not going to necessarily spend a lot of money on. And there may also be certain things within school that actually you can use to equip that area with.
I think writing as well is a similar area to that, isn't it? In terms of
Yeah.
that what's available in school already for you, what you're probably already likely to have in your Key Stage 1 classroom, and I think again it's the organisation of that. It's not overloading it that's really important. Thinking about how many children typically are going to be in that area at any particular time, but also what's going to naturally inspire children. You know, what do they want to do? They're going to be wanting to make books, to make cards, to create link to their real life experiences. So I think it's about thinking really carefully about the decisions around what goes into that area. But I think again, it's another area that you can draw on resources that are already readily available.
Yeah. And then the our audit tool that's available online, and that's free to download under the Ideas and Inspiration tab. That's a really good starting point, because for any of those areas, it lists suggested resources and ways to organise so that you've got that real clarity in terms of the provision that you're offering. So yeah, those ones. You've got
Yeah.
the maths, writing, book area, and then art alongside workshop.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing, I mean, it will take us on a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's quite an interesting thing to kind of draw in at this point as well, is that in terms of the budget itself might be tight. So in terms of these areas being added in, but also I think quite often the timetable is tight, and that people will often look at provision areas and say, well, you know, I can't really have this area or that area. You know, if I did have them, when are we actually going to be using them? You know, when is the time when we'll actually be using them? What's the point of having them if we don't get to use them, sort of thing? And I think if you're really going to have effective practice within Key Stage 1 that builds on the effective practice of your children that they've accessed through early years practice, then I think actually you need to look at it slightly differently, and to look at it as certain things being able to that you can do in an ongoing way as part of your continuous provision, rather than timetabled for a half term and to do it as a topic, as a block. So, you know, the point that I was sort of making earlier on about that idea of, you know, a workshop area with lots of design opportunities, lots of joining opportunities, teaching the children certain skills, you know, that's something that actually could go on and on and on and save you that block of time where you're all having to make a particular vehicle at a
Absolutely.
particular point in the year. You know, you can do it spread out and actually have more quality because of that. And so, yeah, I think in a way the two go hand in hand, the kind of the budget restrictions, but also what I think people see is the time restrictions as well in terms of their timetable.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's one of the joys of continuous provision is the the fact that you've got this space that brings the curriculum to life and gives children that real opportunity to revisit, just constantly to reinforce, but also to really make their skills better, become more effective learners in lots of different ways, and also the ability it gives you to kind of drip feed learning. Not everything has to be in a block, not everything has to be a whole lesson on something where everybody then does an activity. It can be a 10-minute conversation, a prompt, a reminder for children, and it makes such a difference that in the end, done well, it makes our jobs easier in
Yeah,
many ways.
absolutely. What you're also doing, of course, is you're embedding learning over time, which is something that it comes up
Crucial.
time and time again, doesn't it? In terms of, say, Ofsted inspections, in terms of all kinds of different things. That idea of when are you embedding that learning and is it being embedded over time, I think is a really interesting thing to consider. And certainly when people have high quality continuous provision and they've planned out what's there within their learning environment, what they are doing is they're providing opportunities to embed what they've taught.
Yeah.
So you could have taught a skill in terms of joining, a particular way of joining materials together as part of DT. Then can you go and put that skill into practice? Can you go and use it? And it's the same for each of these different areas, whether we're talking about storytelling and, say, block play and small world play and story mapping or whatever it might be. You're providing a very real opportunity to embed that learning in a meaningful and useful way.
Yeah.
And I think that goes back to what you were saying, Andy, about timetabling. Because actually, if your timetable is jam-packed full, your provision ends up becoming a little bit tokenistic, doesn't it? And it's just there because the intentions are there. But actually, if we're not giving children time to actually be in the provision, using it independently, returning to, consolidating, practicing, and kind of, mastering those skills independently, then actually what you end up with is a provision that children can only use through adult directed activity.
Yeah.
But what we want is good amounts of time for children to be in provision, and to be doing that independently. Because I think where Key Stage 1 provision really does differ from early years is we have to think about levelling up independent learning skills.
Absolutely.
That's
Yeah.
very much what it's about, isn't it?
Yeah. And if children only get short bits of time, you know, there's a filler, or because they've finished, or, you know, there's a little bit of time, we finished early, you can have 10, 15 minutes, you'll never get the quality that children can achieve. And
Yeah.
that's, you have to join it up. And I think that's also one of the things that makes it so challenging introducing provision in Key Stage 1, because there are so many things, aren't there? There's so much stuff that you're trying to do, and you're being pulled off in so many different directions. There are demands of SLT, subject leads, all of those things, that it can feel really challenging. Okay, so we've also had a question. If you could have just one area, and we often get asked this, okay, so I've got, you know, I've got one space, I've got one bit of money. If you had just one area of continuous provision in Key Stage 1, what would it be?
I think we're probably going to cheat a little bit
We're going to
here,
cheat,
but
aren't we? By
I imagine
joining
we're all going to say
together.
the same thing, aren't we?
Yeah.
We're all probably going to say block and small world.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
that's exactly what I would be saying. Yeah.
Because
But it has to be one
and
area, doesn't it?
it does. It is one area, really, isn't it?
Mm.
Because you can't have blocks really. Well, you can have blocks on their own, but they're only going to be one thing on their own. But actually, blocks offer you the world building scenario, don't they? Developing the world, creating the world, whether that's a fantasy world or a replication of something they've seen. And then they use the small world on top to actually narrate and story out that story that they've developed, I suppose, a kind of, whether that's orally retelling or role playing it out with their small world people. So they have to sit together, don't they? And I would say that is such an important area for Key Stage 1, because we know that literacy development in Key Stage 1, it's a really prime time for the brain in terms of developing those literacy skills. But we know there's a really big focus on reading, writing, and actually those things can't come until children can and have had those opportunities to develop those skills through play. And a really natural
Talk it,
place
play
to
it
do
and
that.
talk it. Yeah.
Yeah, talk it through in the kind of block and small world area. And I just think those two areas are so essential. But I also think it's really important that we get it right, because what I don't think you can do is, I don't think you can have a successful small world and block area in Key Stage 1 if you haven't got the right resources. You're only going to you're kind of bound by the limitations of the resources that you have. So actually, if you only have a couple of different animals in your small world area,
Yeah.
then they can only
Or
develop a
6
story
sheep
about
and a
those
lion or
different
something.
animals.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's very much in Key Stage 1 we have to be thinking about how this links to the national curriculum. So have you got the resources that link to those things that your children are learning about? Because I think that's really, really important.
I think you're right, and it's also that, you know, that the influence of text, isn't it? Sorry, Nova. You know, but actually, you know, yeah, if we're teaching a, you know, particular book, and we've chosen because of its, you know, its rich potential in terms of language development, understanding of narrative, then actually our block and small world, or small world in particular, has to offer what enables children to then embed that learning, like we were talking about earlier, in terms of the value of continuous provision. How, you know, how does it provide us with the resource that enables children to retell those stories, to retell those narratives, and to build on that in terms of their language development. And I also think that massively links to our understanding as adults, doesn't it, and the quality of our, both in terms of our taught, our direct learning in terms of a text, for example, but also our role with children in that area as well. And I think that really, it's one of those areas, I think, as all of them are, but really reflect the importance of adults in provision and affording yourselves the time, and that can be really tricky. We were talking, you know, earlier about that, you know, the timetabling, but I think it really reflects the value of investing time in that, making sure that our adults are available and there to be able to interact and to really, you know, build on that language, that narrative development, I think.
But it's adults needing to, it's that adult understanding of the development that children go through in block and small world play, isn't it? That actually we're supporting children and moving towards, from creating a structure to adding characters, but then to developing a really quite sophisticated narrative ultimately. And it's without us using that and modelling it and, you know, being part of that play, then we're going to possibly miss that, because we're not going to be observing, but we're also going to miss the opportunity to move that on, I think.
Yeah. I think the other thing to add to that is that I think it's important that adults in the room are in the right mindset in terms of how they're using that provision. And I think the mindset to aim for is that basically what you've got there, if you've got a blocks and small world area, you've got a teaching resource there, and that your children can access that in a wide range of different contexts. That they could use it independently, like, you know, as Nova mentioned earlier on, potentially you could say, right, you've got time, you've finished your work, you could go and do it. But actually, that's not really maximizing the quality of what you've got there. I think, you know, you could, if you think about the whole spectrum of the different contexts to which you could use it, it could be independent, as in completely independent. Your children are using that area. They're coming into it with their own ideas. They're deciding how they're going to use the materials, what they're going to build, what they're going to create, and so on. It could be that actually it's independent, but you've got an adult alongside that child or that group of children, and that adult is using that moment, using the children's ideas and adapting them, or not changing them as such, but using them to add new vocabulary, to extend children's thinking, to ask the right questions, to challenge them, to get them into story mapping and mapping out their ideas, all of those sorts of things. Still very much from a child initiator's starting point, but actually the adult is joining them alongside them. And then alongside that, you've got things like, you know, an adult starting with an idea and sharing a story, sharing an idea of the sorts of things you might do within that area, and then giving the children an open-ended challenge, if you like, of, I wonder how, you know, what would the castle look like in the story? And they create something. And it's directed to a certain point, but it's also the child's response to what the adult has initiated. And that's such a range of different things, isn't it? You know, that actually I think you've got to see it as a toolkit, that area. You know, it's an area that can be used independently.
You know,
it's a toolkit really to use.
Yeah. I think just on blocks and small world, it might be worth just clarifying what we mean by blocks and small world, because I know sometimes there's a confusion, I think, and some resources often put in that space that we wouldn't necessarily recommend are in there. Anna, do you want to just clarify what we're talking about with blocks and small world?
So sometimes there's confusion around small construction and blocks in particular within that area. So what we're talking about blocks, so, you know, when we're talking about small construction, we're talking about things that can be combined and joined, attached to each other to make, so things that make small models. So, you know, kind of Duplo, Mobilo. When we're talking about small blocks, we're talking about blocks that don't join, so stacking, lining up, creating structures. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about blocks in small world, because they're doing something very different. They're serving a really different purpose in terms of what they offer. And as Andy was talking about, you know, that creating a setting with our blocks, and I think, you know, that links to the importance of choosing where your block area goes as well, doesn't it? Because I think you know, the difference of those two things is really significant, because if we're going to create an amazing setting, whatever that might be, based on, you know, something, you know, some amazing creation in our children's imaginations, then, you know, we need the space for them to be able to develop that, but we also need a space that's uninterrupted, that doesn't have foot traffic running through it, because, you know, we know for our children there's nothing more frustrating than trampling feet running on their way through the door or knocking over their fantastic setting that they've created. So so that's what we're talking about. But I do think, you know, the importance of situation when we're thinking about the block and small area,
and a big enough space as well. Often the space isn't big enough. When you think of children moving around on their knees, for example, and trying to reach things, it needs to be probably the biggest floor space that you can provide, doesn't it, really?
Yeah.
So then, that's the one that you would have if you had no others, and I know we're joining two together. and the blocks and small worlds. So what would be next? You've got that one, it's beautifully established, you've got everything you want, you've been able to buy your wish list for blocks and small world. Next, what would you introduce?
I think it would be small construction next.
Yeah.
And I think if we're thinking about that from a curriculum perspective, small construction offers lots of links to the Key Stage 1 curriculum. I often think back to kind of practice from when I was in school, and often we would be really struggling to get DT into the timetable, and it wasn't really something we could fit in on a weekly basis, and so you ended up kind of shoehorning it into like DT days or kind of one every half term, or and I know lots of schools still do this. And actually, whilst that can work really well and the children are really enthusiastic, what it doesn't give you is it doesn't give children time to get kind of more skillful in that arena, and it doesn't give you time as a teacher to assess progress in that area. It ends up becoming a little bit of kind of a bolt on to the end of the half term or whatever it might be. Whereas if we have a small construction area that kind of stays the same all year round and children can return to it over time, what you can do is you can develop those DT skills and those wider STEM skills as well. You can develop those skills over time, and children can get better and get more skillful, and kind of gain mastery over those skills and become more knowledgeable about how things go together and how you construct, because sometimes I think we take for granted that children just know how to construct.
Know what to do.
Yeah, that they know what to do, and we start to then look at the end product. Whereas what we want to be doing, particularly with the Key Stage 1 curriculum, is actually not just looking at end product, although that is part of it, but actually looking at process, and are children able to apply taught knowledge, and that's not just for things like literacy and maths, but actually we have got to think about that when it comes to things like art and DT and science, and where are we starting to develop those early engineering skills really. And I think there's a real place for a strong small construction area, and when I say strong, I think
the right
really
resources,
think that through.
not Duplo and
No, not the same as what you've got within early years. And I think that does build on what you were saying there around that idea of the quality of what you're offering, and giving children the opportunity to show progress within. So it's not just on one day where you're having a real blast on DT, or one particular special week or whatever it might be, but actually over time you're going to see progress. So within year 1 and within year 2 you're going to see progress. So do it over a longer period of time, teach the skills, but allow them to be embedded and to be used, and expect them to be used. But then alongside that, these are all areas that I think you can also really play to your strengths by showing progression from the earlier age ranges. So you can go into nursery, if you have one on site in school, go into reception, then think about, well, actually, what do they have across nursery? What do they already have in terms of small construction in nursery and in reception? And then consider, well, actually, what do we need then in year 1? And there may be there's certainly some argument for having some things that might have not kind of outstayed their welcome, I suppose, that children will already be able to use them, and therefore there are still lots of possibilities they could continue. Okay, so some kits might be able to do that.
is one of those, I think, that you see used really effectively, continuing to be used effectively in Key Stage 1.
Yeah, definitely. And so some things you could carry on potentially, but it's about making sure those things earn their place there. They shouldn't just be there by default. It's actually, well, what do we need? Are those resources going to enable the children to build on their learning, or have they run out of possibilities? If you decide they've run out of possibilities, then what else do we need in that area? And certainly there are lots of quite complex kits that really can and should be offered within Key Stage 1. I think Brio Meg, for me, would be a kit that I would always recommend. I think is a great kit to have in Key Stage 1, made by the same people who make the train track Brio, and it has sort of nuts and bolts and screws and screwdrivers and all kinds of quite complex stuff. Yeah, you can then show that you're building on what the children have experienced in nursery and reception.
I was going to say, quite often we see, particularly when I go out to do kind of consultancy for Key Stage 1, quite often I will see kits in Key Stage 1 construction areas that actually I wouldn't even have in reception. And actually it comes from the best place, you know, the best place with teachers, because they're desperately trying to provide something out of what they've got for children. But I think sometimes we really have to, you know, we've really got to dig deeper and say, actually, the Duplo that we've had in that cupboard for years,
The stickle bricks.
actually we're saying that that's more nursery level. That's not going to be appropriate for year one, or certainly not year one and year two. And I think we do have to kind of hold ourselves as teachers to account a little bit, that we do champion that, particularly where we might have to be asking for budget and those awkward conversations come up a little bit. We've got to know why we're asking for what we're asking for. And actually, we've got to be able to talk about why something that you just click and push together, like Duplo, isn't appropriate for 5, 6, 7-year-olds.
You're better off not having it, aren't you? You're better if you can't establish the area effectively with, you know, the right resources. To be honest, I would say don't do it until you can.
Yeah.
Because you will just get the same outcome every time. They will just make kind of towers, or they might make weapons and things that you don't want them to be doing. Or things that are far too low level. And actually, I do think with Key Stage 1, certainly we want to be talking to children about levels of expectation, and this is how old you are, and this is what we expect you to be doing, and increasing independence. And actually, if we don't provide them with the right resources to do that, then actually you can't blame them for just kind of building the same things over and over again. We have to really ask ourselves those deeper questions about, as Andy mentioned, has it earned its place in that classroom for those children?
And will it work for children all the way through to the end of Key Stage 1, towards those end of Key Stage 1 expectations, when they are then ready to be, you know, ready for that transition into Key Stage 2? And if we don't want to see it there, you know, you don't want the Duplo or the, you know, whatever it is, do you? I do think this is one of those areas, construction, that does lend itself to a bit of kind of stockroom raiding, if you like, to see what else, because it can be that we have little bits of kits that are effective but then don't get used because there's not a full one. But actually you can do some combining, and I know the Key Stage 1 construction collection that we sell is actually a combination of different things, so that children are really challenged to not just use one construction kit, but to join things in different ways. I would also say that, and I know this was something I had to do, if it's not your own personal strength or interest, construction is one of those areas where you have to get in there and play and learn, and often be taught by the children about what joins and how it can work and all of that kind of thing, because it can be one of those areas that feels a bit, ooh, not my thing. I don't really know what to do there, so I'll leave it to often that group of boys. I think you need to get involved.
But I think that's good. That's also good practice anyway, isn't it? I think it's only by being in an area, being alongside the children, and for yourself trying to build the model or build a castle or whatever it might be in the Blocks and Small World or in the small construction. It's only by being in there that you notice what the children notice. So, you know, you could be in there, say it might be, say you have Mobilo, for example, and you hadn't realised that the children's models don't seem to be growing in complexity. They don't seem to be developing that far. And then you realise that the connecting pieces, there are only 3 or 4 connecting pieces. So as soon as when they've got to that point, that's it. They've run out. They can't go any further. But unless you've actually been in there and tried to do that yourself, you're not going to notice that necessarily. And so I think it is quite a good... I think it's quite a good habit to get into, is to go into the different areas and to try to do what the children would be doing. To play alongside them, to be doing the sorts of things that they would be doing, as a kind of, I suppose, as a bit of an audit, really.
But also, you're showing them that you're a learner too, aren't you? And you're showing them that, do you know, I mean, construction is one of those things where you separate everything by component, and I can always remember saying to them, what is this bit? You know, what do we call this particular join, or what do we use it for? What are we going to call it on our, on our storage? And that I think is a great thing to do as well, to be the learner in a situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So we're going down the list, and I know there's a couple of questions here that kind of go alongside. So one is, we've been asked to introduce provision, but we don't want to do too much too soon. We want to get 2, 3, 4 areas really well established before we try to do everything. And alongside that, our classroom is very small. We can only fit in 3, maybe 4 areas of provision.
Yeah.
Which ones would we include? So it's kind of like, we've got blocks and small world, we've got small construction. Where next? What would be next?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, I think the person that's asked the question is absolutely on the right track with it. I think that idea of taking a few areas at a time and focusing on getting those right, if you're just starting out with provision, actually is a very sensible move.
Yeah.
Partly, I think, because it's then more manageable. You can introduce the areas carefully, you can set expectations, you can make sure that also the practicalities of organising the space, labelling and all of that sort of thing, you've managed to do it, rather than perhaps trying to do the whole thing in one go. So I think starting smaller actually is quite a sensible thing to do. I also think as well that if your school are completely new to continuous provision in Key Stage 1, there's a bit of a responsibility there in terms of the teacher who is trying to then get that in place get it right. Which I know sounds like an odd thing to say, but you don't want you don't want it to fall flat. And then in 2 years' time, somebody say, well, what about continuous provision? And they go, well, we tried that 2 years ago. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
And that, comes down to it just not working that time. You want it to, if you're going to do it, it's got to be manageable. You've got to feel in control to a certain extent. It can't run away with you. And so starting off with a few areas, I think does definitely work. And I think that is sensible. It then means that you can work out things like timings and timetables based on what provision you've got as well, without it being the whole thing. So yes, I think that's first of all. In terms of areas, we've talked about some of those areas already, haven't we? Blocks and small world probably would be on that list, I think. Small construction, probably. And probably, I think that kind of the sort of paint and workshop area, if you were looking at a few areas done well, those would be areas, from my point of view, I think I'd start with. Have you got others that you would go for, do you think?
I think for me, like a next step beyond what you've already got, kind of those easier to set up areas, plus block and small world and small construction. I think beyond that, an obvious one linking to the curriculum would be like an inquiry space.
Yeah.
And I think this feels like quite a different shift from early years, and it should. But it's very much that space where children will learn about the wider curriculum. So science, history, geography, it's where they'll do their kind of historical inquiry, that sort of thing within that space. So you want it to be a space that's really well resourced. And quite often, I think Nova mentioned earlier about kind of raiding the stock cupboards, but quite often schools do have and have bought into lots of kind of historical artefacts or lots of geography equipment and those sorts of things. So you probably do already have quite a few bits in school. It might just be that in kind of a more traditional teaching model, you will have got your box for that topic.
Yeah.
Brought it out into your classroom, set up a lovely table. And if the children are lucky, they might get a chance to have a look at those things. And I say that, again, it comes from the best will in the world, doesn't it? But actually, the beauty of a continuous provision model and using that as your pedagogical choice is that children can access those materials every single day. They can explore with the globe before you come to teach that unit on continents and oceans. They can kind of get that exploratory drive and actually really dig into the equipment and kind of get it out their system a little bit while they're actually exploring those tools and artifacts. So I think having a space that's dedicated to inquiry, I think is really important. But again, as we've mentioned for all the other areas, the resourcing of that and the modelling of how to use that space is really important, because I think inquiry spaces even if you've set them up really well, children don't often know what to do in those spaces because they've never accessed them in early years usually. Usually it's brand new to Key Stage 1. And there are like very different resources that they haven't really come across before, whether that's kind of a historical artifact or whether that's kind of a map that they're using or a tool that they're using. They may never have seen it before. So I think modelling in that space. And don't forget like direct teaching in that space as well. I think sometimes we just think of direct teaching as being something that happens on the carpet or at a focus table, but actually, do you teach geography from your inquiry space using the tools that are in that space?
Yeah.
Because I think that that's really important. But I imagine you'll have lots of those things lying around school already, and there'll be things that you already use. It's just thinking about how you set up that space.
Yeah.
And I know often, Nova, you talk a lot about the Early Excellence Studio units and how we can kind of use those for inquiry spaces to really showcase those individual artifacts or tools and those sorts of things.
And it can be
So
amazing.
yeah.
And
And
interestingly, sorry, it's one of those areas as well that you quite often see Key Stage 2 thinking, oh, well, actually, this is something, because it builds as a kind of reference tool, doesn't it? A reference library. And you can have, it can all be together, so you have your kind of science resources, observational resources, magnifying glasses and things. But I've seen some schools do some amazing things where they've developed a museum, so they've got the history area, they've got the geography area, and the lovely thing is there, and I think one of you mentioned it earlier, rather than that, this is our topic, we're getting everything out of the cupboard for a couple of weeks, few weeks, then they all go back in the cupboard. Some of those things are there all the time, so they return to them, and it stops it being that separate. We're doing maps this half term, but then we're not going to look at them for another term and a half. Whereas actually those maps, which we know children love, and the the street maps, the globe, all of those things are constantly there. And also they're there when we've just read a story and it's mentioned, I don't know, South America, we can just say, oh, where is, we can do that kind of, that constant linking that's so important.
Yes. I like the way as well that these provision areas, I think, provide an opportunity for the learning to feel that it's come more from the children than just from the adults. And what I mean by that is that you can, of course, still plan a topic and you could still plan out, kind of generally where you're going to go in terms of teaching and learning over a block, but that actually the resources that you have within the room that might link to that particular block. So like a globe, for example, or like certain photographs that might be there in your inquiry space, like close-up images from a microscope, all kinds of interesting things that you can plan it out so that by having certain resources in the room, that the children will then be asking certain questions. When they ask those questions that link to that topic, you're ready to go with it. So it feels like that actually what you're doing is you're responding very much to what they're asking for. And you are, but you've done it in quite a roundabout way where you've also planned for those questions to come from the provision. And to me, that's far more powerful than just sort of at the start of a half term saying, right, everybody, we are learning about whatever it might be.
Yeah.
I think when it comes from questions from the children, it's far more powerful.
Yeah. Okay, so this question's a nice one. Our children still want to role play, which they will, won't they, often in the book corner or somewhere, if they don't have a role play area in Key Stage 1, but we don't have the range of, the home corner kitchen units, the lovely things that they have in reception and all the accessories. So we don't have that available to us. So how can we approach role play in Key Stage 1?
I think, well, when we're talking about Key Stage 1 often, and particularly after that kind of first term in Key Stage 1, we're often talking about themed role play rather than that kind of home corner role play. And I think the great thing about that is actually kind of a few very well chosen open-ended resources can go a really, really long way. So, you can drop in things like, scarves, hats, bags, a till, and some money and some resources linked to that. There's quite a lot of open-ended possibilities that don't require, all of those. The units are fabulous, but don't require all of those resources to make it work. And I think the other thing that works really well in Key Stage 1 is where children are creating that themselves, because actually, particularly with that themed role play, you want it to be led from their interests, their experiences, their fascinations. Actually, we are suddenly incredibly interested in a vet, whatever it might be, or a shop, and actually we're incorporating our writing development in there, where we're taking notes, we're writing prescriptions in our doctor's surgery, whatever it might be. So I think actually in some ways Key Stage 1 probably lends itself more to, we haven't got all of those resources, but actually we can be a little bit more creative in terms of how, what we choose and how we involve the children in developing that, I think.
Yeah.
And then those children that still want to go and play home, or have the tea party, or can still do that, can't they? And often we do get a lot of children, particularly that first year 1 term, who still need to do that. So it kind of supports all of those different approaches, doesn't it?
I was in
definitely.
the school last week that they had created. There was a group of children that absolutely wanted that, and they had literally made in workshop. They'd made an oven, they'd made a washing machine, they'd literally created all those resources because the school didn't have those resources.
Yeah.
But actually, they.
Well, that's perfect, isn't it? And that's when we, as teachers as well, we have to let go of that feeling that it all has to look beautiful, and the children will. Similarly, I can remember children making, when you raiding, every single photocopy box, paper box, and they made all the kind of cages for the back of the vets, to put the pets in after they'd been, cut open or whatever. But it's that the children will do more and more, and it doesn't look neat and pretty like something you might have stayed after school making for hours. They can make the posters, they can do all of those things. And I think, I can remember children making, this is pre-COVID, making masks and trying to get them to fit for the vets. It's that kind of joining up of going to other areas, using combination of skills. And in a way, the whole process is slowed down, rather than us thinking, right, tonight I'm making a vets for them, I'm going to print everything off, stick every single word up that they won't look at, but I'll put them all on the wall anyway. But actually them spending a couple of days or even longer creating the area, planning it first probably, doing a bit of research about what do we need in a vet before it's ready. So the whole process is kind of deepened and slowed and kind of extended. And we just have to, and also those people that come in and look and think, well, that's a bit messy. It needs to be about the purpose, doesn't it? The value and the learning involved.
Yeah. There are certainly some themed role play that fits very well with the sorts of topics that people generally will do within Key Stage 1, aren't there? So talking about things like, having a vet perhaps, and learning about parts of an animal's body perhaps, or looking at a skeleton, all of those sorts of different kinds of things. And the same with things like a doctor's surgery perhaps, similar kinds of ideas, those sort of life processes and living things kinds of ideas, those discussions around our bodies, around actually the human skeleton, the bone structure, the organs and so on, that actually all of the conversations that can come from that can lead to some interesting questions that of course you can then use and you can keep going with. And it's that sort of link to inquiry which is quite interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
That the experiences within role play will lead to some interesting inquiry, interesting questions that will keep this process going and keep it very much alive.
And I think that's what's key about, as you mentioned, children developing that space themselves, because we can spend a whole of a half term if we wanted to making a wonderful role play area,
Making a
but
place
actually
in the space station, or
and actually how relevant is that to children's learning? How relevant is it to the things they're interested in? How relevant is it to the national curriculum? How relevant is it to life as well? Because I think you can quite easily find things online and download posters and all those words, as you mentioned, Nova, and stick them all around your role play. But actually, where's the learning is what I would be saying, and where am I seeing that curriculum in action? And I think you know, both the national curriculum and the children's curriculum, like where am I seeing that learning and that progress?
Yeah.
And I think by developing their own space, you are seeing learning from that moment they start that research right the way through to them actually role playing in that space as well. And then I think, you know, you see them then transforming the vets into a doctor's surgery because they're actually hooked onto that
They see the
learning,
link,
and you might be teaching animals including humans, and it all fits in, doesn't it? But I think it's about, we can't put our ideas on what we think, you know, children might be interested in just because that's maybe a topic that we're doing at the moment. We've really got to think carefully about incorporating children's ideas into that space, because they won't use the role play if they don't know what to do
No.
in there.
Oh, that's it, isn't it? What knowledge do they, and understanding do they bring with them? Will they know how to be, how to behave, how to play? And you know, we want them to talk, don't we? We want them to, you know, all of that oracy, all of that social development that's there in a good role play area is so important.
Yeah. Yeah. It does, of course, as well raise that question of visits and visitors. You know,
Yeah, it
giving
does.
children you know, if children haven't had the experience of going to a vet, for example, and not, of course,
Walking to
not
a
all
vet.
children will have done, then some children will know how to use that space, other children just won't.
Yeah.
And are we giving other children the opportunity to start kind of at a level playing field, if you like, at the same point as everybody else? Not every child will have had that experience. And so you may be able to have a visit, but it might be more practical to have a visitor. So somebody coming into school to talk about their role and to talk about what they do and what a vet looks like and what we do as a vet, you know, all of those sorts of things are rich learning experiences anyway, and then link that to your role play.
Yeah. But if we create a space that to us looks beautiful, but when children go into that space, they don't know what to do. There isn't really any conversation. They have a tea party, or in you know, in the travel agents or whatever it is. It's about going back to keeping them at the heart of it, isn't it? Rather than the ideas that we think will look good, or you know, and it's lovely, isn't it? Setting up an area. You know, some of us really enjoy that, but it's coming back to those children at the heart of it. Okay,
Yeah.
another question. Would you, or should you, still have sand and water in a Key Stage 1 classroom? Given that you've
We're all
spaced.
going to say the same thing here again. I think for me, absolutely, if you have the space. And even if you don't have the space, I think sand and water can be done in miniature. It doesn't have to be using a big sand and water tray, because let's
No.
face it, most Key Stage 1 classes don't have space
Yeah.
for sand and water. If you do, that's wonderful, and I absolutely would. But if you don't, then I think it's about being creative about how you can do it. And it might be that you don't have sand and water out at the same time, but actually you have a space that can be used for small scale sand and water, or perhaps another malleable material at that point, if that's something that children need or are interested in.
Yeah.
So I think it's about, I would say, don't be afraid of having sand and water in Key
Absolutely.
Stage 1. I think sometimes we think that that top down view is that it's frowned
It's just
upon, that
play. Yeah.
that's just play, and you know, that awful phrase of that's just play. But it's being seen as a nursery thing, and I think I'm seeing, you know, I don't know about you, but I'm seeing more and more in reception a lack
Not
of sand
having
and
it.
water, and actually, you know, not understanding the benefits of sand and water and what that brings to children's learning, because you know, it's huge, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing to add to that is that both sand and water experience, both sensory experiences tend to be great for communication and language. You know, that children, first of all, just the structure of it, in that, you know, you're standing around a tray with your hands in that tray, you're likely to be facing another child at that point. You know, you're basically, you know, you're around that space, and it's a sociable kind of experience, but also sensory experiences anyway tend to lead to lots of chatter. You know, whether it be a dough area, you know, that's typically where you often get lots of talk, or whether it be around the sand tray or whether it be around the water tray, you tend to get lots of talk. Now, when when we talk to schools, when we engage with schools about what are their needs, what are the children's needs, what are you finding from your children at the moment, communication and language on entry to school is so low at the moment, isn't it? And we're hearing that all of the time. You know, the needs of the children are great in terms of communication and language needs. And of course, we're then talking about, well, what do you have in terms of malleable opportunities? What do you have in terms of sensory experiences as well? But that shouldn't just stop at the end of the EYFS. There's no lack of challenge there, but also I think from a communication and language point of view, I think there's a great argument for having it. I think you're likely to find that your children still have that need in terms of communication and language. Therefore, it does earn its place there based on the needs of the children.
I was just going to say, I think a little bit like you were talking about, Luella, it's about permission, isn't it? And I think some of that comes around the planning for it, doesn't it? You know, having absolute confidence and security in the decision you've made. So if we are having sand and water provision, actually, you know, what's the underpinning curriculum links, as you say, you know, communication and language being, you know, absolutely undeniably a significant part of that, but actually being able to really demonstrate the breadth of the curriculum that's being developed as part of that provision, I think gives you strength in your decision. So I think, you know, some of it is about that kind of feeling that you have permission to do that, because I think you're right that, you know, there is a bit of a, you know, potentially in some settings that kind of top-down opinion that says, actually, you know, what's that for? You know, what's the value? And I think so, you know, I think a lot of that is about continuous provision in Key Stage 1 ultimately, isn't it? It's about having the confidence to say, absolutely, this is the underpinning learning, this is how the curriculum's being really effectively embedded through it. So I think that, you know, that kind of planning can really support the decisions around that, because, I think,
which is where our continuous provision planning guides come in handy, don't they?
Absolutely.
And when you think about children, you know, you see examples of children who are being taught capacity, for example, who haven't played with anything to do with capacity, haven't filled things, tipped things, poured things, compared since they were in early years. And it's that, isn't it? And that's one tiny example of what, say, water or dry sand might give a child. But what are we expecting from them when they're not having those experiences? So again, coming back to curriculum is so important.
And I think we're also seeing an increase in SEN needs, kind of nationally, diagnosed and undiagnosed. And actually, sometimes when you dig deeper into early years practice, you notice that some of those needs can quite easily be met through provision. Now, the same applies for Key Stage 1. And actually, we think about omitting sand and water from our classrooms and not giving that a second thought. Actually, I wonder how many children would benefit from having that, just from a pure sensory angle, and filling up that sensory bucket, and giving them those experiences, you know, across the day, across the week. You know, some children will need very hands-on sensory experiences every 90 minutes.
And they'll find it from the maths counters or something, won't they? If they don't have a place, they will find their sensory experience somewhere else.
Absolutely.
So we have to think about that as well. You know, we already know it ties in with the rest of the curriculum, and that's a given. But actually, can it offer another layer for us? Have we got bubbly children, or fizzy children as they call them, and that actually they're only fizzy because they need the sensory bucket filling up? Actually, if they could access that maths in the water tray instead, surely that's much more powerful for that individual. And we're saying that there's an increase, that's multiple individuals probably, maybe half the class. So I really do think it's worth thinking about, and not just thinking, well, actually, you know, I haven't got the space. Well, do it in miniature.
Do it on a smaller scale.
In a tray if you have to. Like, really, really make sure that you've thought about every angle to get that into your provision if you can.
There's certainly as well, linked very much to what you were saying, something very calming about those sorts of sensory experiences of whether that be sound or whether that be water. You know, when children are dysregulated, when children are upset for whatever reason, actually going to the water area and exploring, there is something very calming about that. And, at a time when I know, and you will all know, that actually when working in schools, people are finding that they have children who are dysregulated quite a lot, or that they are really struggling in terms of their emotions, that actually, yes, it's not the whole answer to the issue, of course not. But it does could just help, I think,
Absolutely.
having water provision there.
And it's a space where children and children with adults can be together, can kind of work alongside, can communicate. It's a kind of, threatening is the wrong word, but it's a nice space to be in for that shared
Yeah,
experience.
it
And
feels
that's
safe.
it's a space to talk or to not talk, but to be alongside somebody, and that's important to provide as well.
Mm.
Okay. So you've got your lovely big classroom with your bifold doors and everything else. You've got all of those areas.
Is it grand designs?
Yeah, grand designs, and then that's without going to outdoors. We'll do that next.
Yeah.
I suppose then it's coming back to each area in turn, and we've mentioned this really, and really focusing in again on what your core offer is. Which areas are you going to develop? If you've got parallel classes, do they have the same? Do they have, equality of opportunity in terms of the resourcing? But also then looking at how, we mentioned workshop as a starting point because, it's cheap and easy. But how could you then develop your workshop further? Might you introduce woodwork, for example? Might the art area, how do you introduce and allow paint to be accessible? What range of brushes, what range of different art resources? Do you have a specific area for observational drawing? Is that linked to the inquiry area? It's all of those kinds of things that once you've established it, it's an ongoing process, isn't it, of re-evaluating and, it's, and I suppose back to that idea that, 2 years from now, no, we gave up on provision, it didn't work. If you've got that really clear idea, this is our core offer, these are the areas, this is what we'll have, this is why, these are the planning guides, then that's less likely to happen, isn't it? Because it's not dependent on 1 or 2 people at that time deciding to try it, but it's actually, it's a whole school pedagogy, it's a whole school approach to teaching and learning in Key Stage 1.
Yeah.
And I think on that note, Nova, you have to have subject leaders and senior leaders totally on board and on that journey with you, because if subject leaders don't see why those provision areas are there and how their subject comes through provision, then you will be squeezed back into a very different pedagogical model.
Books and evidence, written evidence.
Yeah, so it's I would say take them on the journey with you every time you're explaining and having those conversations with your wider Key Stage team, that you're also having them as a whole school conversation, because it absolutely has to be a whole school approach, doesn't it? And
Yeah.
it very much is not just a replication of early years, and it cannot be, and if it is, that's when it seems to go wrong. So I think it has to have its own, its own space within that school that is kind of acknowledged, it's put on that pedestal as being an important priority, and it's really underpinned by kind of the full breadth of the curriculum, but it's underpinned by everybody's knowledge and everybody contributing to that and that whole journey.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot to do.
And alongside that, I think talking about the needs of the children, keeping the needs of the children very much central to the discussion that you're having. So whatever you know about your children from the start of the journey in nursery or in reception, and then where they get to in terms of the end of the EYFS, how many children do achieve that good level of development? How many children are at that point? Is that 60% of children, 70% of children, maybe more? Even at 80%, you're still talking about a large proportion of children that don't achieve that. And so therefore, what is the diet for those children coming into year 1? I think it's about knowing the reasoning behind it that I think is crucial, isn't it? So there we are. So lots of conversations there, lots of questions, and it's an ongoing question and an ongoing dialogue, isn't it? That people who are putting people who are introducing continuous provision into their classrooms in Key Stage 1, it is very much an ongoing journey of asking the right questions all of the time, of reflecting, having the discussions within your team, your Key Stage 1 team, but also, as Luella was just saying, the wider team as well. Well, first of all, I hope you found that useful, but also if you want support in terms of introducing continuous provision, and of course in terms of planning for it and guidance, there's lots of information, as I think we mentioned earlier on. There's lots of information on the Early Excellence website. In the ideas and inspiration section, you can find the plans, the continuous provision planning and example plans that we mentioned earlier on. You'll also find audit tools as well there within that same tab. You'll find podcasts that you can listen to that will support you as well in terms of starting off and just getting going. And of course, watch out for our Key Stage 1 starter packs, which are on the way. Keep an eye out for those coming soon.